Questions on the Enola Gay or the B-29 or the nuclear devices, I'll try and answer them.
Actually, the bombs were made as part of Manhattan Project.
I know. They actually blasted the first bomb in Manhattan itself, in a desert.
So they made more than one bombs, and the other ones are in Oak Ridge.
Okay.
I work in the welcome desk at our museum downtown. I just love talking to you. You are the most wonderful, most outgoing, funny, engaging. I just love the conversations I have. Oh, good. You take off, you only have to remember one thing. You got to bring me my book. So, commercial aviation. Let's start with commercial aviation. 1931, the Germans, Junkers Company, came up with this three-engine design. It's called the tri-motor. Held about 15 or 16 passengers, went about 120 miles an hour. Nothing too spectacular, but for 1931, it was pretty impressive commercial aviation. Ford built a tri-motor, Boeing built a tri-motor. It's a very common configuration for that era. What's its range? It's a very interesting question. What is the range of an airplane that doesn't have a bathroom on board? The range is the weakest bladder on board the aircraft. Excuse me, pilot, we have to land. I'm going to guess a couple hundred miles. So, I had a gentleman the other day ask me, how come it looks like potato chips? Rippled potato chips. That's an interesting description. It's called corrugation. Corrugation. Early aluminum alloys were not particularly strong, and by giving them that ripple effect, which is called corrugation, it gave it much more strength. Junkers were used by the German military during the Second World War to transport troops and for paratroopers. Our airplane was actually built under license by a Spanish company and flew during the Spanish Civil War. Anybody know what years the Spanish Civil War were? 36 to 39. Many people say it was the precursor to the Second World War. Many of the military tactics, equipment, airplanes, fighting styles were kind of perfected in that horrible, horrible Civil War in Spain, 1936 to 1939. After the war and after the Second World War, the folks at the folks at Lufthansa, notice the German national airline name on this side, restored this airplane for us. We thought that was awfully nice of them. But they decided to restore the exterior to Lufthansa, the interior still Spanish military. Why? I don't know. And we didn't ask a lot of questions because they did it for free. Junkers, I used to tell my tours that Junkers were flying until 1981 in the Swiss Air Force. I had a Swiss general here the other day who corrected me and said Junkers are still flying in Switzerland today. And I figure he knows. So let's head down this way. I had another gentleman tell me they're still flying in South America as well. For an airplane that's first started flying in 1931, that's pretty impressive.
44 minutes back here, say, follow it.
We all know this tragic story of Amelia Earhart. She was lost attempting to circle the Earth in 1937. She was a bit of a fashionista, and she designed many of her flight suits, and that's one she actually flew in. So her airplane, the one that she was successful in flying across the Atlantic, is in our museum downtown. The beautiful Lockheed Vega, little red airplane up above the welcome desk on the second floor. I'm going to talk about this aircraft right here, this beautiful airplane, one of my favorite in our collection, the Boeing 307 Stratoliner. For you airplane aficionados, it may look like a B-17, and Boeing built the B-17, and they did. They took the wings and the propellers and the engines and the tail surfaces from a B-17 and decided to build a commercial airplane at the same time. We're now in the late 1930s, early 1940s. This is commercial aviation. The B-17 was not pressurized, but Boeing wanted a pressurized cabin, and this was Boeing's first pressurized compartment. Late 1930s, I think it went into service 1940. So very comfortable flying, very expensive, only the elite business people and movie stars flew in 307 Stratoliners. it could make, the gentleman asked me the range before, this airplane could fly across the United States with 2 stops. So we're making dramatic improvement in getting long distance airplanes. They only built 9 of them. They built 10, the test one crashed. They built 9 that they sold. 5 were sold to TWA. 3 were sold to Pan Am, including ours. And 1 was sold to Howard Hughes. He was TWA's largest shareholder at the time. And my assistant will come up here. No, you're going to come in here? Do a Vanna White thing here. So, Hughes was going to fly his airplane around the world. You're going to hold it just like that, sweetie. Oh, you are good. Howard Hughes was going to fly his airplane around the world, but World War II got in the way and those plans went away. It changed hands a number of times, and today, the fuselage of Howard Hughes' 307 is this little houseboat in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and then pan this way. Very good. This is the Cosmic Muffin, it's called. It was a houseboat in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and up until just a couple of years, they rented it out for parties, but it's in disrepair these days. Very good, sweetie. This is the only intact 307 in the world. Is the one you're looking at right here. Just an unbelievable aircraft.
Good afternoon. The free guided tour will begin in approximately 15 minutes, starting from the tour desk, located at the rear of the SR-71 Blackbird on the lower level.
So, moving on in aviation. After the war, all of the 307s were conscripted into the military during the Second World War and flew as cargo planes. After the war, they were given to the airline companies, but commercial aviation had bypassed the 307 and no more were built. Now we're in the late 1940s. Boeing has another brilliant idea. Oh, Dana? Well, no, she's okay. If you want to sit, I can handle this one. I can do a tour. I can't do many. I'm getting kind of old. Boeing decided that, the military is building jet-powered bombers. They might want to have a jet-powered refueling tanker. Everybody know what I mean by a refueling tanker? It's kind of a gas station in the sky. You refuel airplanes with another airplane. Well, before jet-powered refuelers were built, Boeing was using the KC-97, I think it was, a propeller-driven airplane to try and refuel a jet-powered bomber. So that's the propeller-driven airplane on top refueling the bomber. The propeller airplane is pedaling as fast as he can, and the bomber is going as slowly as he possibly can. It was not very efficient. And Boeing bet $16 million of their own money that the military would want a real nice jet with a jet refueling tanker. You see that okay, honey? It's a KC-135. They're still in service today. There's a jet refueling a jet. Perfect. 16 million bucks Boeing bet of their own money. And they said, just like with the 307, well, since we're building a military version, let's build a commercial version. Well, the military loved their version. Commercial aviation, not so much. They weren't ready for a 4-engine, cross-country, non-stop airplane, and they just didn't buy them. In August of 1955, William Allen is the chairman of the board of Boeing, and he says, I got to beef up sales. So outside of Seattle, they have the annual hydroplane races at Lake Washington. 200,000 people are going to be in attendance. William Allen invites airline executives from around the world, and he has this airplane, do a demonstration above the crowd. Now his test pilot that day, his name is Tex Johnson. You can only imagine what a cowboy Tex was. And Mr. Allen said to Tex, just fly the airplane low and slow over the crowd. Give him a thrill. Tex said, you got it, boss. Well, Tex took things into his own hands and decided to spice things up just a little bit. And he performed not one, but 2 beautifully executed barrel rolls of this airplane. Full inverted 1G barrel roll of this airplane. Look, did you get that, honey? You good? Over the crowd in Lake Washington. Most people in the crowd, this is our airplane, inverted, over Lake Washington. Most people at that time had never seen an airplane that big, let alone one pull that stunt. He enjoyed it so much, he went, turned around, came back, and pulled off another 1G barrel roll. If you go to YouTube and you put in Tex Johnston 367-80 prototype 707, you can see a very grainy film of that. Unfortunately, it's not very well done. So, everybody in the crowd was absolutely thrilled except one person. I think that might have been his boss, Mr. Allen. And the next day in his office, he was chewing out Tex, and he said, "Tex, what were you doing yesterday?" And Tex said, "I was selling airplanes, boss." And you know what? Within a few months, major airline companies around the world began buying what is now known as the 707. Commercial aviation rocketed into the future, and non-stop flights across the United States and Atlantic were made possible by 1958 when this airplane first started flying. It was a phenomenal success for Boeing and for commercial aviation. It remained a test bed for Boeing until 1972. In 1972, Boeing gave this airplane to us. We said, "Oh great, what are we going to do with it? We don't have a museum." Even the museum downtown wasn't built, not that it would have fit. So it got stored in the desert outside of Tucson, Arizona. In 1990, Boeing engineers went to find it. They uncovered it, they got the engines cleaned off, they started it up, they flew it to Seattle, they restored it for us and flew it back here in 2003 when we opened the museum. And while they were looking for this airplane at the desert in Tucson, they found this one that everyone had forgotten about. They got it cleaned up, they started it up and flew it to Boeing, and they restored it in the same production line in which it had been built by volunteers who had originally built it. I could be making that stuff up, but I'm not. You can't make this stuff up. The Concorde, supersonic aviation. How are we doing on time? Oh, perfect. I wanted to get to the Discovery right about the 1 hour mark. So supersonic transportation, that's this Air France Concorde. 2 times the speed of sound, 50,000 feet. Passengers could see the curvature of the Earth from 50,000 feet. The test planes flew in 1969. In 1969, airline executives, just like back here with the 707, were a little concerned about how expensive this airplane was going to fly. And then they were told it was going to cost 1 ton of fuel per person to fly this airplane. 1 ton of fuel. See, I'm not an aeronautical engineer. I'm not a rocket scientist. We all know 1 ton of fuel just doesn't make any sense. But if you want to travel at 2 times the speed of sound, carrying only 100 passengers, because the airplane had to be very sleek to reduce the drag as it's traveling at 2 times the speed of sound. Also, right about the same time, the United States government decides, there's not going to be any more supersonic flights over the continental United States. So now you lose the advantage of the supersonic flight over the continental United States. So it might be 3.5 hours from London and Paris to New York and Washington, but then your time to Chicago, Houston, and the West Coast, no advantage anymore. Yes, sir?
Why do they say